All right, good to see everybody out this morning. Glad you're here on this nice, cool morning. Unusually cool outside for November, but everybody's bundled up and we're in a warm building now. We're thankful for that. Just before class, I did put out a new sheet for the next installment in our study of the Judges. And if you're reading ahead, right, if you're trying to sort of read ahead and get a glimpse of what's coming, we haven't left Gideon's family in the next one. We actually encounter his son Abimelech. And we've got some interesting questions about Abimelech and the behavior of Abimelech. So be sure either now or after class to grab a copy of that. And next week we will study Abimelech. And if you've read that story, you know it kind of starts with a bang. It's the very first thing he does is we've got some questions about what he does. So please get a copy of that, a couple, 3 questions or so, and we want to have good discussion on that. Today, we're finishing up our study of Gideon. It looks like Tom's got a few extra copies of the Gideon notes. If you need some Gideon notes, let him know. Otherwise, let's be turning our Bible to Judges chapter 7. Judges chapter 7. Thank you, Tom, for doing that. Judges chapter 7. Last week we covered 1 chapter. This week we're going to cover 2 chapters, chapter 7 and chapter 8. We're going to do our best to get through those 2 chapters and finish out our study of Gideon today. I think Carl needs one, Tom, if you will. Thank you. Again, you'll need the notes for Gideon, and I think today we're on the back side of that. I'm not sure how many we're on the front side, but it's 2 pages, front and back, and then we're on question number 5 today, starting. And I think we only have like 2 or 3 questions left. We have just a few more questions. All right, so here's question number 5 in our study of Gideon. This starts us in chapter 7, and probably, I'm just guessing, of all the stories in the book of Judges, besides the familiarity people have with Samson, I think this might be one of the more familiar stories in Judges. That's my guess on this. So here's the first question, question number 5 in our notes on Gideon. Why did God reduce the number of men that would fight? And that's in the first 25 verses. We'll look through some of those and read some of those verses. What is he attempting to restore in the people? What's the lesson we learned about the reason for worship? That's sort of a side question as a part of the story in verse 15. There's some worship given, and we'll talk about that in a second. How could Gideon say that God had delivered their enemies before it happened? We'll talk about that as well. Interesting lesson to be learned from that as well. Also, what can we learn about wisdom by the way Gideon overcame the enemy? So at the tail end of that, once God reduces the number, they go about conquering their enemy in a very wise way. They think through it, and they really have a really neat way of conquering their enemy on this occasion. So let's start with the very first of the questions that are sort of collectively together, which is, why did God reduce the number of people? You would think, right, as you go into a mighty military match, you'd want as many people as possible. Art?
Well, God answers that question himself right here in the book.
He sure does, doesn't he?
He sure does. He says, because if I let you claim glory for yourself, against me.
Yeah.
So this way it makes it pretty clear who won the battle.
Yeah, so as Art mentioned, if we start in verse 1, we're reminded again that Gideon also has a secondary name, Jerubbaal, and that is Gideon. Verse 1, all the people who were with him arose early and camped beside the well of Harod, so that the camp of the Midianites was on the north side of them by the hill of Moreh in the valley. And the Lord said to Gideon, the people who are with you are too many for me to give to the Midianites into their hands, lest Israel claim glory for itself against me, saying, my own hand has saved me. So Art's exactly right. This is one of those occasions where God specifically outlines why he wants something done. And on this occasion, we learn that it's to prevent Israel from claiming glory. So let's talk about what happens real quick. And I want to come back to that thought. That's a very, very important lesson, even for us today, about making sure that we're trusting in God and He's getting the glory for the things that we're doing. Sometimes we don't do that very well. But let's start verse 1. We just read it. We do see here that his name is Jerubbaal, and if you go back to chapter 6, remember what we talked about in chapter 6. Gideon went at night and he tore down the altar of Baal, and the people were not happy about it. Remember, they wanted to actually kill him. They said to his father Joash, they said, "Bring out your son, and we want to kill your son because he's done this." And remember, he said, "Well, if Baal is alive, you let Baal plead for himself." Right? If he's real, then he's certainly capable of defending himself. And his name is based on that. If you drop down to verse 32, therefore on the day he called him Jerubbaal, saying, "Let Baal plead against him because he's torn down his altar." So he's named in honor of that action of tearing down that altar. So you see it again in chapter 7 in verse 1, an obvious naming that connected him to the destruction of the altars of Baal. There's also a well mentioned here. It is the well of Harod in verse 1. And I don't know if you have a marginal note, if it has sort of a footnote as to the meaning of Harod, but the root here and the standard meaning of it is the well of trembling. And I want to talk about that for just a second. I think it's, sometimes in the Bible, places are named in connection to some state of mind or some event that transpires, right? You have with Jacob, right? You have the naming of the place Bethel because he has a meeting with God, and so he names the place in honor of the God that he meets in that location. Drop down to verse 3. We read the first two verses, but I want to draw something and I want to make a point that it's for all of us. It's for me, it's for all of us in this room. Verse 3, "Now therefore proclaim in the hearing of the people, saying, whoever is fearful and afraid, let him turn and depart at once from Mount Gilead." And 22,000 of the people returned, and 10,000 remained. So you have a reduction of the number from 22,000, or more than that, 32,000 to 22 of them, they return and go home, and 10 stay. But it's at the beginning of that, he said that some of the people were really afraid. They were fearful. And it's interesting that in verse 1, they're at this place, the well of Harod, that means the well of trembling. They're perhaps named in honor of what was taking place with the state of the people's mind. And I think this is I don't think I'm drawing, I don't think I'm imposing anything on the text. I just think it's a good principle here, and that's this. In Judges chapter 6, we read last week, the people had turned their back on God, right? We read about their descent from God again. They started their turning away from God, and then the few verses that follow, they actually turn back to God. Now, couple that with what's going on here about the fear and the trembling, and here's what I think this is reminding us of. There is a lot lost in apostasy. There's a lot lost in apostasy. When people go away from God, there's a lot lost in that. And even when people come back, are they sometimes slow to regain some of the things they had before they apostatized? Like the confidence in God. And when people apostatize, it takes a long time for those things to come back. When the kind of confidence and the courage, the boldness that sometimes you had before you turn away from God, and then you turn away from God, and those things it lingers a while to come back and have those things. I think they're still struggling with that here, even though they've made a turn back to God, and they've already reclaimed one victory, right? They've already had a couple of victories already. There's still fear and there's reservation, and it just takes a while for that to come back. Forgiveness is always immediate, but it takes time to rebuild a confident and strong mind, and I think we need to remind people, Don't take that step over the Rubicon, because even if you come back, right, you're going to lose a lot in apostasy. You just lose a lot in that. And I have my suspicion that that's why a lot of people relapse into lives of sin. It's tough for people to come out of sin when you're apostate, right? That's the definition of your life. You've given yourself back over to sin. And you've probably seen it too, I'm sure, where somebody returns to the church and some of them go back into a life of sin. It's because they've lost a lot of that grounded confidence in God. And I think this is a good lesson here. Even though they've already regained some ground with God, they weren't quite where they were before the apostasy back in chapter 6. So there's a good lesson here about how fear and reservations still beset the mind when people have turned away from God. Now, let's go back to what Art said. Verse 2, God offers his explanation. He says, and this is just so far into military thinking, there are too many people. He said that. Verse 2, the people here that you have, there are too many. And he explains that he did not want Israel to claim glory for itself against him. The standard test, right, of an effective military is size and strength of the soldiers and the weapons, right? If you can remember in your study of like history, what were Romans noted for? Maybe some cultural things, but what were they known as? They were an efficient fighting mechanism. They had a lot of soldiers. Their weapons were the latest and the best, and they were a force to be reckoned with. You never wanted to go against the Roman Empire militarily. The same with America. At least we claim right now that we have the strongest military in the world because we have more of everything and better of everything and more high-tech of everything. But that's not what God is doing here. God is removing the temptation of the people to trust in those things as the reason for their victory. Because if you go into a battle and you go into a battle against 100,000 men, but you have 1 million people and you win the battle, then your claim is, we just had more people and we're a better military force. And God said, you're not going to do that. You're going to know that I am the one who delivered you. So how does he do it? Well, what's the story? Start in verse 3. What's he do? How does he get from 10,000 down to 300? How does he get to that number? There's a test he gives, right? What is it, Gene? Yeah. All right, so you take away the ones that have apprehensions, and then you're left with 10,000, but somehow the number gets from 10,000 to just 300. How does he get there? What's the test? Okay, he's testing the mentality of the people who are actually going to go into battle. So he takes them down. There's a source of water, and he has Gideon basically say, I know you're thirsty, have a drink. And all of them do. But some of them drink differently than the others. What's the difference? They're all drinking water.
While they're drinking, they pay attention to what's
All right.
going on around them.
All right, so some of them drink water without any regard to their surroundings at all. And you have an expression here about some lapping like a dog, and the idea would be that they're sort of drawing it up to their mouth, and they're just sort of using their tongue to drink the water. But notice in verse 5, he brought the people down to the water, and the Lord said to Gideon, everyone who laps from the water with his tongue as a dog laps, set apart by himself, likewise everyone who gets down on his knees to drink. So you have some people who just plunge their face in the water, right? And then you've got some who sort of in an upright position drew the water to their mouth. And in verse 6, the number of those who lapped, putting their hand to their mouth, was 300 men. But all the rest of the people got down to their knees to drink. And God says to those people, I don't need you in this battle. Go home, and I'll just use the 300 people. So in verse 7 and following, he takes the 300 who lapped, and he saves those to deliver the Midianites into their hands. And then he says, let all the other people go, every man to his own place. So he reduces the number to 300. From 22,000, 10,000 remained, and from 10,000 to 300. And even at 10,000, God was still saying, it's too much. And so God is testing their situational awareness. That was a good test of that. There's a little bit of self-control in the way that the 300 men drank the water. And so he narrows that number to 300. And then you have the battle sort of forming in verses 12 through the rest of the chapter, essentially. In verse 12, he mentions here the Midianites and the Amalekites. And this is another veiled reference, I think. We've had one in chapter 6. You see it again in verse 12 where he says, they're lying in the valley as numerous as locusts. And you just can't help but think that there's some imagery that connects them to their past when he talks about locusts and camels without number here. And so you have this innumerable host of soldiers versus 300 men. Now, from a human perspective, that seems impossible, right? You don't walk into a battle with an innumerable force with just a handful of people in comparison, because in reality, the truth is, in a situation like that, what's the outcome going to be? From a human perspective, you're going to get slaughtered. You're going to get annihilated on the battlefield. And look at verses 10 and 11. God said, now, there's obviously some reservation, right? Because this is God speaking. He says, if you're afraid, go down to the camp with Pua your servant, or Purah your servant, and you'll hear what they say. Afterward, your hands will be strengthened to go down against the camp. Then he went with Purah, his servant, to the outpost of the armed men who were in the camp. And so God is actually conceding on this occasion that Gideon and others, from a human perspective, might have been really concerned about the potential outcome of battle where you had 300 men against a force that looked like a bunch of locusts out on the field. From a human perspective, sometimes people are afraid. So they're instructed to go down to the camp and hear what was being said. And in verse 13, Gideon does that. Gideon came. There was a man telling his dream to his companion. He said, I have a dream. To my surprise, a loaf of barley bread tumbled into the camp of Midian. It came to a tent and struck it so that it fell and overturned, and the tent collapsed. And his companion answered and said, this is nothing else but the sword of Gideon, the son of Joash, a man of Israel. Into his hand God had delivered Midian and the whole camp. And so it was when Gideon heard, in verse 15, the telling of the dream and its interpretation, what's he do? Worships God. You think his attitude changed? He was a much different man after he had followed the Lord's advice of going down. And when he heard that through that visit, it had its intended effect on the heart of Gideon. What God is doing on this occasion is restoring the heart of the people. He's restoring their faith and their courage, right? And that's, just a moment ago we said, sometimes that's something that's lost when people apostatize, even when they turn back. It takes a while to rebuild that, and God is helping to rebuild that. I love this because the Bible never tries to hide, ever, the faults of some of the characters who are in the Bible. It just tells us what they struggled with. And why do you think it does that? Because we struggle with those things. And this is a time when we can go, you know what, I've been in the same situation. Maybe I've been away from the Lord and I've come back and I'm not quite where I need to be. I'm still struggling. Here's Gideon and the other people still struggling with fear and having reservations, and God never tried to hide the fact that they were struggling with that. What he did was he helped that situation. It shows us that as God addressed them, he's essentially doing to us through them, exposing our own faults, fears, and weaknesses and helping us along the way. So we have this situation through the reduction in the numbers that God is helping us. Now let's get to that question embedded in question number 5 about worship. Does this seem for some people like an odd response to what God has done, or is this a natural response for what God has done? How would you characterize this? He worshiped God. What would you say about that? Even situationally, does this not seem like an odd time to worship God when a battle is brewing outside? What are your thoughts on this, Joel?
300 people and God, they're going to conquer this massive people. So what do you do when you're in the presence of somebody that powerful? You worship. And he recognized the power of God. And wait a minute, I'm going to take these 300 people and we're going to defeat this mass.
Totally agree. What does that tell us about worship? What's the motivation for worship for us?
Gratitude to God.
It is. It's all about gratitude. And that's what he's doing on this occasion, is he's doing that. Now, we'll make another point in just a second, but hold your place and go with me to Psalm 116. Psalm 116. Psalm 116. Psalm 116. Drop down with me to verse 12. It's almost a rhetorical question, but it's very thought-provoking the way it's stated, verse 12. What shall I render to the Lord for all of his benefits toward me? Is that a good question? Has God been good? And for Gideon on this occasion, he'd been really good to Gideon. He was about to be really good for the people, and he does this. He says, I'm going to deliver the Midianites and the Amalekites into your hand. I'm going to do it. I'm going to help your fear. Go down to the camp, listen to what they're saying, and you'll be encouraged by that. And he was, and Gideon responds. Well, listen to verse 13. What do we do for God because of all the good that He's done for us. Verse 13, I'll take the cup of salvation and call on the name of the Lord. Now that phrase, call on the name of the Lord, means a little bit different in the Old Testament than it does in the New Testament. Okay? Everywhere that Abraham went, he would build an altar, and then what would he do? Call on the name of the Lord, right? Like 5 or 6 times. In the Old Testament, calling on the name of the Lord was a reference to their worship. So when he says, what are we going to do that God has been so good to us? In summary, he says in verse 13, I know what I'll do. I'm going to worship Him. Because worship is a reciprocation, like Bobby said. It's a return of gratitude for all that God has done for us. So on this occasion, Gideon is doing that. So it's not odd that he would do that in verse 15. It's exactly what a person should do, that God has been so good to them. Now, I'll say this. I was thinking out loud, or at least in my mind I'm going to say it out loud, but I'm going to write this in my notes after. There's a battle brewing outside. Is worship necessary to help people prepare for what's beyond? And when people don't worship God, like we're in today, it would be within the assemblies of the saints. When people aren't in the assemblies of the saints, for all the reasons they suggest, are they really prepared for the battles waiting outside? There's a strength that comes from the assemblies that you get, and this is a thing that's going to push Gideon into what he's going to do. So there's a great principle about that here in verse 15. Now, what happens in there? I don't know if you've gone ahead and read the rest of the story. What do they do? There's a little bit of wisdom in the way they go about this, because look what they've got to work with: 300 people versus a group of people that are like the locusts in the field or like camels without number, right? So how do they go about this? There's a little bit of wisdom. What's their plan, Gene? Right.
And so he would have led the way for a huge multitude of folk. And so Gideon positioned 300 men around the trumpet.
Yes.
So the appearance would have been maybe 300,000.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, he's really smart the way he goes about this. And what time of day is it? It's nighttime, right? So if we drop down in verse 16, he divides the 300 men into 3 companies. He put a trumpet in every man's hand and went with empty pitchers and torches inside the pitchers. And down in verse 19, he tells us when this happens, when he's doing it, it says the beginning of the middle watch. Now, they had a division usually within the night of about 4 watches. They would divide that up. The beginning of the middle watch would be at 11 p.m., and would extend beyond that for several hours. So you're talking about in the dead of night, right? It's really dark outside. And is there even armies today do this and train for it. Is there sort of a tactical advantage to doing something at night? What's one of the benefits of doing something at night? You're surprised, you're unprepared, and then there's the lack of visibility, and they didn't have night vision goggles back then, so all you see is torches in the distance and trumpets blowing. And when they do this, as Gene mentioned, the appearance and the sound of it, what's their first thought? We're dead, and they just flee. It's brilliant what they do on this occasion. Of course, this is God's wisdom working through them, but they flee, and Gideon calls for everyone. At the end of this, he calls for everyone, even Ephraim, and everybody jumps in. They call for everybody to act, and they defeat Midian. It's just a brilliant plan in the way it works out. Now, that tells us something about wisdom. We've said this before, and it's just hard, even when you're dealing with an adult group, right? So kids struggle with it more, but even adults struggle with it. What is wisdom? What is that? It's knowing how to use knowledge, right? It's not infallible, right? We're not suggesting that, like we read Proverbs 1 and the rest of the chapters of Proverbs where it talks about, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, and we have wisdom and how it works out. It's not infallible because sometimes we make mistakes, but wisdom is, we know what the truth is, and then we're taking the truth and we're making it practical. We're putting it in use, and wisdom is the ability to put knowledge in use. And the more we use it, the more seasoned we become, the more well-rounded we become in our use of the truth. But part of wisdom is also kind of the ability to project ahead and say, if I do this, then here are some consequences of that. And I think what you see here is just a brilliant display of wisdom, because for all the things that Gene was talking about, they project and they say, if we do this, it's going to give the appearance of a much larger force, and there's a real chance we pull this battle off. Of course, we're going to with the Lord. In fact, he had already told him he was going to do that. And so even today, it's the ability to look at a choice we're going to make and project what the consequences of that choice would be. If I do this, there's going to be some real hardship. Or if I do this, there's going to be some real benefits to that. And I think that's how we see wisdom play out in Scripture. We certainly see it. We see it here. And then in this chapter, look at verse 14. Go back to verse 14. I want to talk about this, and we're going to move on to the next question. Verse 14, it says, this is when the man is interpreting the dream or commenting on the dream. He says, God has delivered Midian and the whole camp. Now, this is before God had ever done that. And there are other times in the Bible where you see that, because, like, for example, in Joshua chapter 6, if you read that chapter, when they're getting ready to take the city of Jericho, he'll say, God has delivered Jericho into your hand, before they had ever stepped a foot to march around it. How can the Bible say things like this before they had ever happened? Yes, Art?
He promises us
Yes.
by faith.
Yeah.
You know, if we have faith in God, and we
Exactly.
feel like God will
Yeah.
do what? And look at all the promises we got.
Yeah. In fact, in 1 John 5, to us today, he says, I have given you eternal life. I've given it to you. We don't physically possess it yet, but in the mind of God, it's so sure he can speak of it as a present reality, right? And of course, it's conditioned. It's conditioned upon our obedience and being faithful to him as much as we can be. But I love those statements in the Old Testament, because they're walking into a battle, and God is saying it's a foregone conclusion. This battle is yours. If you'll just trust me, you have no need to fear. With 300, you're gonna mop the floor with a group of innumerable people. You're going to do that. So it's an amazing set of words in the Bible. That language is just amazing in the Bible. All right, let's move on real quickly so we don't run out of time. I'm going to try to finish this today. Number six question. Gideon eventually triumphs over the Midianites. This gets us into chapter 8. What do you make about what happens next? And this is verses 22 to 28. I want to save that real quick, but go to Judges chapter 8. And we can't read every verse, for sake of time. I hope you're reading but between Sundays, and you're getting the bulk of it. Beginning in chapter 8, verse 1, this is an interesting thing, because they've already taken two of the princes, right? They've taken at least one major battle from the Midianites, and Ephraim has a complaint. Did you read ahead? What's their complaint?
They didn't get invited to the battle.
Yeah, wait a minute. You've left us out. How could you possibly leave us out? And look what their verse 1, the men of Ephraim said, why have you done this to us by not calling us when you went to fight the Midianites? And they reprimanded him sharply. And they're calling in question his ability to lead. And let's talk about his answer in verse 2. He says, what have I done now in comparison with you? Is not the gleaning of the grapes of Ephraim better than the vintage of Abiezer? What in the world is he talking about? Yeah, Joel?
Look what all you've done, look what all you have done, because remember, he called them in now when they're pursuing.
He did it. He invited everybody to the fight, so it's not like they weren't invited. They were invited. Okay, so at the end of this fight, if you go back to verse 25 of the previous chapter, it may be on the same opening, right, just a few verses above. It says, they captured two princes of the Midianites, Oreb and Zeb. They killed Oreb at the rock of Oreb, and Zeb they killed at the winepress of Zeb. And they pursued Midian and brought the heads, literally the decapitated heads of Oreb and Zeb, to Gideon on the other side of the Jordan. Who did that? Ephraim did. Ephraim did that. Right? So they didn't show up for the heat of the battle, but they finished the battle. And what's Gideon doing here? There's a principle of leadership embedded in what he's doing here. They've got a complaint, and what's he do? He compliments something they did and literally diffuses the situation. Even though they didn't show up for the heat of the battle, they finished the battle by killing those two princes. And so Gideon's using a little bit of wisdom here. He's being diplomatic, not compromising, but he's being diplomatic. He's being gentle with them, and he answers them. He's essentially saying, who gets more glory from this battle, me or you? Look what you did. You killed the 2 princes at the end. I mean, that's a pretty significant thing. And essentially they turn around and go, oh yeah, that's a pretty good thing that we just did there. And he just literally just dissolves the situation. That is a necessary trait for leaders, the ability to diffuse tense situations with grace and humility and still maintain their faithfulness. And then just an interesting thing there. Because really, I mean, in truth, at this point in history, could they afford a civil war against some of their own people at this point? They're still fighting the Midianites and the Amalekites, but he couldn't really afford a civil war with Ephraim, so he diffuses the situation. And in verses 4 through 21, we won't take the time to look at all that because I do want to get to this last part. You can read it. They eventually just conquer Midian completely. They break free of Midian control, and you see that through verse 21. All right, I want to get to this. Verse 22. What do you make of what happens here? Okay, so I think this is our... Okay, so we've got one more question after this. Verse 22. Then the men of Israel said to Gideon, rule over us, both you and your son, your grandson also, for you've delivered us into the hand of Midian. Gideon said to them, I will not rule over you, nor shall my son rule over you. The Lord shall rule over you. Is he good to go at this point? That's pretty good. All right, verse 24. Gideon said to them, I would like to make a request of you that each one of you would give me the earrings from his plunder. Midianites and some of the other nations were known to do that, probably nose rings, but whether earrings or nose rings here, but they were gold. For they had golden earrings because they were Ishmaelites. Historically, we think they were probably more nose rings than anything. Verse 25, they said, we will gladly give them, and they spread out a garment, and each man threw it in the earrings from his plunder. So they're agreeing with that. Watch what happens. Verse 26, the weight of the gold earrings that he requested was 1,700 shekels of gold. It was a lot. Beside the crescent ornaments, pendants, and purple robes, which are in the kings of Midian, besides the chains that were around the camel's necks. I mean, they were loaded, and they take all this. That's the spoils of war. Then Gideon made it into an ephod and set it up in a city, Ophrah, and Israel played the harlot with it there. It became a snare to Gideon and to his house. Thus Midian was subdued before the children of Israel, so they lifted their heads no more, and the country was quiet for 40 years in the days of Gideon. What just happened? What in the world is going on? What are your thoughts on that? Good thing, bad thing, Art?
I think bad thing. I think Gideon, they start to think, well, look what we have done, and set this up as almost as an idol.
Yeah, almost like an idol. And in fact, that's kind of what they end up doing.
Well, the ephod was dedicated to the Levites. I mean, Aaron and his son, and it was to be restricted to them. Now that he is doing something basically in violation of God's laws,
Yes.
This is for the Levites,
Yep.
and the priests.
100%. You and Art right on the dot there.
Wasn't it sort of like the golden calf?
Yeah, something just like that. I think what Art's saying is, because the very next thing is people end up in idolatry, and Gideon seems to put the stumbling block right before them. So they do as he requests, and he makes this ephod, which is, if you go back to Exodus chapter 28 and read that whole chapter, that's part of the high priest's attire. It's what they wore. It belonged to the priesthood. What tribe was Gideon from? Do you know? Here's a simple question. Was he from Levi? No. He had no business messing with an ephod. He had no business messing with that. He was from the tribe of Manasseh is what tribe he was from. He had no business messing with the ephod. So it seems that Gideon fails to follow the directions, period, regarding the ephod. The making of it, the donning of it, where it was placed. I mean, he puts it up in Ophrah, and all of the places, at least at this point in history, where service to God was going to be rendered, where should it have been rendered?
Jerusalem.
In the tabernacle at Jerusalem, not in Ophrah. It's supposed to be in Shiloh. That's where worship was taking place, in Jerusalem. So Gideon sinned. Whatever his motivation was, whether he was thinking, I'll set this up so people can really be thinking about God, or whether he set this up saying, well, this is a way for people to remember what I did. Either way, he's wrong in doing that, because he usurped God's directives in doing that. And in verse 28, it says, it becomes a snare to Gideon and to his household. It's a dark mark, a stain on his record, at least to this point. And it's just a sad thing to see at the end of his career for this to happen. So, number 7, real quick, with a few minutes left, what happens when great leadership is gone, according to verses 29 to 35, and then how do we prevent that from happening in the church? Let's just real quick read those, and then we'll go back and discuss it. Then Jerubbaal, the son of Joash, went and dwelt in his own house. Gideon had 70 sons. Those are going to be an important part of Abimelech's story, who were his own offspring, for he had many wives. His concubine, who was in Shechem, also bore him a son, whose name he called Abimelech. Verse 32, Gideon, the son of Joash, died in a good old age. He was buried in the tomb of Joash's father in Ophrah of the Abiezrites. So it was, as soon as Gideon was dead, that the children of Israel again played the harlot with the Baals and made Baal-berith their god. Thus the children of Israel did not remember the Lord their God, who had delivered them from the hands of all their enemies on every side, nor did they show kindness to the house of Jerubbaal Gideon in accordance with the good that he had done. What happens when Gideon's gone? They just went right back to doing what they had always done. Now, do you think he contributed to that at all? You know, it's like it would be like somebody who's an alcoholic, and they go to AA and they finally break the habit, and somebody says, "Hey, let's celebrate. Here's a drink." And that's kind of what Gideon did. He goes, "We've broken free from the Midianites. Let's set up this golden ephod in Ophrah." And it sort of scratches the surface, and the old wound starts to bleed again, because the very next thing is, once he's out of the way, they're just full-blown back into idolatry again. So as soon as he died, the people went back into idolatry. And whatever his character did to prevent them from doing that, once he was gone, the floodgates of idolatry came back open. And does that happen sometimes when you have good leaders? Or, with Gideon, he messes up kind of at the end, but his record had been good of what he accomplished for Israel. Does it seem to happen that when you have good leaders and the good leaders are gone, that the floodgates just kind of open up and everything goes? Why does that happen? How do we stop that from happening?
You have to stay close to the word. Every person
Yeah.
has to be prepared.
And sometimes it's, like for example, in the church, I've known where you have congregations that have had excellent elderships. And when the eldership dissolves, the congregation just sort of quickly departs and goes a different way entirely. Why does that happen? Because you've had good leadership. They're not sticking to the word, Art?
It's really hard to pass on leadership if people don't want to step up and take that.
It's tough. Yeah.
You've got to prepare for it, you've got to plan on it, you've got to train for it, you've got to study for it. If people aren't moving up like that, it's hard to pass on good leadership. And
Yeah,
if you've got people that show good points while you're as a manager, as a leader, yes, you can kind of pick those and bring them along, but it's a tough battle.
It's a tough battle, Bobby.
You have to make sure you have a good training plan too to bring them.
Yeah, you got to train, and there has to be discipline. You've got to bridge the gap in leadership, and you can't just be planning for the day when there's just no leaders at all. You sort of bridge the gap, and you're bringing men along to do that. Sometimes is it the congregation's fault for that? When you have good leaders, the tendency is to kind of step back and just let the leaders do everything, and then once the leaders are gone, the people are like, "Oh, what do we do now?" I think that happens sometimes. So it's important for the congregation to want to be faithful too. It's just sad to see that in history when you have that take place. Any thoughts on Gideon? I know we kind of rushed through the end, but what an interesting story. And I kind of hate that his story ends the way that it does, because what he does is not good. In fact, God said it's a snare to his record. You see a stain at the end. Any thoughts at the end? All right. Abimelech. All right, so if what Gideon did was not good, Abimelech's is far worse. And Abimelech is the son. He's the son of Gideon, at least one of the sons of Gideon. And it doesn't go well. So read chapter 9 and think about Abimelech. And we have some principles about justice and all those things, how they work in chapter 9. So we'll talk about that. Really appreciate your input. It helps me to grow. I always, I like to study it, but I don't see everything. And so sometimes you help me see things I don't see in the text. But thank you for that. We'll come back and we'll look at Abimelech next week. Can't wait to hear what you have to say about that. Thank you, guys. Appreciate it.